Human race, the classification of our species into distinct groups. Despite being constantly talked about, today race is one of the most misunderstood topics in the world. Up until the mid-20th century, it was universally agreed by all scientists that race is real and that we differ along genetic lines in scientifically categorizable groups. But, due to major social and political changes starting around the mid-20th century and a desire to be anti-racist, certain people started criticizing the concept of race itself as being intertwined with racism and therefore something that needed to be brought down, regardless of whether this was scientifically accurate. This concept, known as race denialism, advocates for the idea that you cannot categorize humans into distinct groupings along biological lines, that there is an insignificant or even no genetic distance and variation between races, and that there are no differences in attributes and characteristics amongst races that are a result of genetics. This video aims to debunk race denialism and the idea that race is nothing more than a social construct. I am going to be looking at the biological reality of race, why race is real, and what differences lie between the various human races. Make sure you watch to the end of the video before leaving angry comments, because it's likely that some points I bring up earlier in the video will be addressed later. Also, I will be leaving sources for everything in the description. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the video. Hello Internet, welcome to race theory. What actually is the meaning of the term race? Sometimes it refers to a classification rank existing below a subspecies, and sometimes it's used as a synonym for subspecies. For the purposes of this video, we will go with the second definition, as that's what most people mean when they talk about race in a biological sense for humans. If race is essentially the subspecies of human, then what does subspecies mean? A subspecies is generally defined as a rank below a species where two or more population groups of the same species have different physical and behavioural characteristics from each other, but can still interbreed and create viable offspring, and are usually geographically isolated from each other. It's this geographical isolation that causes these different populations to evolve in different directions, as the difference in climate and environment will affect these populations in different ways. Genetic drift, which is where frequencies of gene variants will change due to random chance, also cause these differing evolutionary paths. Geographically separated populations will not evolve in the exact same way even if the environment is kept the same. In 1949, before our present day ability to look into genetic data, two or more groups in a species would be classified as different subspecies if 75% or more of the individuals in the species can be definitively classified as belonging to one of the groups based on visual inspection. Now, this 75% rule specifically isn't really relevant today, but comparing morphological differences between populations is still a relevant factor when it comes to many recent studies. I think it's pretty clear that if you compare the physical appearance and differing cultures and behaviours of the human races, with regards to music, food, architecture, clothing, language, and so on, we would almost certainly be classified as being separate subspecies under this definition of behavioural and morphological differences. And there has been research to show that the 75% rule can easily apply to humans. In fact, Charles Darwin, the father of the theory of evolution, had this to say in his book, The Descent of Man. But since he attained to the rank of manhood, he has diverged into distinct races, or as they may be more fitly called, subspecies. Some of these, such as the sub-Saharan African and European, are so distinct that, if specimens had been brought to a naturalist without any further information, they would undoubtedly have been considered by him as good and true species. Of course, there are now more modern methods of distinguishing subspecies by measuring genetic distance, which yields far greater accuracy beyond simply observing visual and behavioural differences, but I'll get back to that later. How are races then classified? In the past and present, there are various different racial classifications, but typically it's broken up into at least three main groups: Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, or what would be today called Caucasoid still, and then Sub-Saharan African and East Asian, to put it in less obsolete terms. Normally, Amerindians or Native Americans and Australoids or Australian Aboriginals constitute their own races as well. These distinctions were made along biological rather than geographic lines. For instance, North Africans were, or rather still are, considered Caucasians rather than being part of some kind of pan-African race alongside sub-Saharan Africans. Disagreements still exist today, like whether or not South Asians are a separate race to West Eurasians, if Pacific Islanders are to be considered Mongoloids, Australoids, or their own separate race, or how Ethiopians are to be classified due to having an admixture of Caucasian and sub-Saharan African ancestry. These disagreements are reflective of the actual ancestral and genetic ambiguity and complexity when it comes to populations not well separated or who are admixed. It also mirrors the disagreements that researchers have when classifying subspecies in animals. Now that I have laid out the basics, I will explain exactly how and why race is real by going over some of the common criticisms people have towards the concept of race and giving some of my rebuttals against these claims. Many race deniers claim that since human DNA is 99.8% the same, this means that race is non-existent, but this is not true. To understand why, first I need to give you a little science lesson. Different attributes like your cognitive abilities, psychological traits, physical appearance like your eye color and height and so on, are created by deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, which every living creature possesses. DNA contains all the instructions needed to build and maintain a living organism. It is made up of pairs of chemicals called base pairs. There are 4 types of chemicals, A which pairs with T and G which pairs with C. A gene is a specific sequence of DNA with instructions encoded by these base pairs, usually to make specific types of proteins which perform different functions in the body. For example, some genes might carry the instructions to produce a type of protein that produces and distributes melanin to the eyes, giving you hazel eyes for instance. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but it's just to give you some kind of idea of what's going on here. The number of 99.8% similarity between human DNA refers to only these base pairs in the DNA. Genes are encoded by very large numbers of base pairs, and a single base pair difference in a gene can dramatically change the functions and the effects of that gene. This means that the percentage of genes that differ between humans could theoretically be very large, even if the percentage of base pairs that differ is very small. In addition, some genes control other genes, so a single base pair change in one gene could affect many other genes, causing large ripple effects. Even if only looking at base pairs, since there are about 3.2 billion base pairs, then a 0.2% difference means that there are still about 6.4 million base pair differences. The number of different unique combinations possible of such individual base pair differences is huge. To put it in perspective, the genetic disease sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation of one base pair. Furthermore, the number is frequently misinterpreted as meaning that only 0.2% of human differences are due to genetics. Humans share a very large number of characteristics, like all humans sharing the characteristics associated with being primates, and all humans sharing numerous basic cell and biochemical structures and functions. This means that the non-shared DNA may be very important for the remaining characteristics on which humans do differ from one another. Also, it should be pointed out that the number of base pairs that humans and chimpanzees share has been estimated to be 98.77%. Other studies have stated that humans share approximately 99.7% of our DNA with Neanderthals, approximately 90% of our DNA with cats, and approximately 60% of our DNA with bananas. The percentage of shared DNA isn't a meaningful metric for how different two populations are from one another. This is also wrong. When people say this, normally they are referring to the fixation index, or FST, the most commonly used modern measurement of genetic distance between populations. It tells us how much of the genetic variation of two populations is due to differences between the populations rather than within. An FST of 0 means they are identical, and an FST of 1 means they are nothing alike. When it comes to mammal populations between subspecies or closely related species, the FST will typically lie between 0.05 to 0.2, or 5% and 20%. The FST between the Eurasian and North American grey wolf, for example, both considered separate subspecies, is 9.9%. If you look at the coyote and the North American grey wolf, two different species, the FST is 15.3%. In chimpanzee subspecies, you have Central and Eastern chimpanzees with an FST of 7%, and Nigerian, Cameroonian and Eastern chimpanzees with an FST of 21%, and Central and Nigerian Cameroonian chimpanzees with an FST of 16%. A 2014 paper found 3 populations of humpback whales to have an average FST of 12%, and what's interesting is that it was this very paper that was used to justify humpback whales to be classified into 3 different subspecies. If you then apply the fixation index to humans, what you will find is that across the 3 races of Europeans, East Asians and Sub-Saharan Africans, the FST is 12%. You can look at the data for between the individual populations themselves as well. One such study, for instance, showed the FST for Yoruba Africans and Europeans to be 15.3%, Europeans and Chinese to be 11%, and Chinese and Yoruba Africans to be 19.2%. Comparing this to other mammal subspecies, this is well within the range to be considered as separate and distinct subspecies. The fixation index isn't the determining factor in what makes populations be considered subspecies or species, but it can be a supporting factor to consider. Race deniers will often say that genetic differences within humans are clinal, meaning that they gradually change slowly across a geographical area like a gradient. This can be for a number of reasons, such as more mixing occurring between populations in the middle of those 2 geographic areas rather than at the further corners. According to race deniers, because there are no hard lines between races therefore do not exist. First of all, even if human race was perfectly clinal, we would still be different. Take a colour gradient between red and yellow, for example. Red and yellow are of course different colours, but the transition between them is gradual. This doesn't mean colour doesn't exist. Colours are different and categorising them is useful to us. Or blood pressure variation. Medical researchers will break the continuous variation of blood pressure into distinct categories ranging from normal to hyperintensive crisis. Knowing if someone has stage 2 hypertension blood pressure, for example, can be useful to a doctor and predict certain things about that patient. And even so, human races are not perfectly clinal like a colour gradient. Different races are separated by geographic barriers, such as mountains, oceans and deserts, like Australian Aboriginals or Native Americans being separated from the rest of the world by oceans, Europeans were separated by the Ural and Caucasus mountain ranges, and Sub-Saharan Africans were separated by the Saharan deserts. Cultural practices can also lead to less intermixing of populations, and studies have shown that same race populations are more genetically similar than different race populations, even when both populations are separated by the same geographic distance. In fact, many species of animals with identified subspecies are connected by intermediate populations that change in a clinal fashion. This is known as intergradation. The fact that some populations mixed with other populations doesn't have any impact on our ability to be able to classify and distinguish boundaries between races, and to prove it we will now be looking at cluster analysis. This is essentially where a computer looks at a bunch of genetic data sampled from lots of different human populations around the world and algorithmically sorts it out into however many population clusters you tell it to. As you can see, when you divide many populations from all over the world into 7 groups, the world splits between Sub-Saharan Africans, Middle Easterners, Europeans, South Asians, East Asians, Indigenous Americans and Oceanians. You can see how different populations are mixed in different ways, such as East Africans being of mixed Middle East and African ancestry due to migration from the Middle East. Unfortunately, however, this study does not include Khoisan people or Pygmies who would have split off into their own race all before Middle Easterners and Europeans split off. Here is a different study that shows exactly that, where if you split the world into 7 clusters, you get Khoisan, Sub-Saharan Africans, Native Americans, South Asians, Caucasians, Aboriginals and East Asians. You can also see what this looks like when you sort human populations into other cluster counts. Here, Middle Easterners and North Africans split off from Europeans after 9 clusters. While this study does cover more populations, the sample size for the number of individuals and their genomes is much smaller compared to the other cluster analysis I showed. A genome, by the way, is the complete set of genetic information in an organism, in this case in a person. I would also like to make it clear that I am not trying to create an accurate, definitive and formal categorization of human races here. That's something beyond the scope of this video. I'm simply demonstrating that you can categorize human races into clearly separate groups based on their genetics, and that genetic studies very closely correlate with the average person's intuitive understanding of race, even if some races have varying degrees of admixture with different races. Skin pigmentation is actually one of the weaker factors in the difference between races. We are able to look at particular gene groups among East Asians, Sub-Saharan Africans and Europeans and compare the genetic distance of these gene groups using the fixation index. As you can see, the gene groups highlighted in red, which involve physical appearance like your hair, skin color and bone structure, aren't as good a distinguishing factor for your race as many other gene groups in your body. For example, the ones I have highlighted in blue are gene groups associated with the development and function of various parts of the brain. So no, skin color and appearance is not the only difference between us. The argument that there is more genetic variation within members of the same race than between races originates from a scientist named Richard Lewontin in 1972. He claimed that dividing humans into races or subspecies is biologically invalid because most genetic variation in humans is down to differences between individuals rather than between races, and this somehow means that the concept of race is meaningless. Remember that 0.12 FST between human races I mentioned earlier? This means that 12% of genetic variation is between races, while 88% is within races. But as I have shown, numerous other animals with multiple identified subspecies have similar or lower FST values than humans do. So clearly this idea that there must be lower genetic distance between members of the same population than with different populations to be considered separate subspecies is false. You would need an FST higher than 0.5, which would exclude even many species of a genus from being considered separate. You can also take this same line of logic to argue that schools don't matter, and school level data for student outcomes is not worth considering because schools only account for 10 to 15% of variation in students' academic achievement. Or you can argue that because the income difference between blacks and whites in the US is smaller than the income variation found among blacks and among whites, that the income disparity between blacks and whites is insignificant and not to be discussed. Or how the variation in height within males is larger than the variation in height between males and females, so therefore women aren't shorter than men. Obviously these examples are all totally ridiculous, just like the argument that there being more genetic distance within races than between races means that race doesn't exist. Furthermore, an FST of 12% represents the average increased probability of a single gene being different. Analysing a single gene in isolation is unlikely to tell you the race of an individual, but by analysing multiple genes together you can predict someone's race to an extremely high degree of accuracy. To get a better understanding of what this all actually means, let's say that you were asked to guess whether a person was a male or female based on whether they were taller or shorter than average, or hairier or less hairy than average, or whether their voice was higher or lower pitched than average. If only one of these facts were told to you, you could make an educated guess, but there would be a decent chance that you would be wrong. If you combine data on, say, 20 such sex differences, your chances of correctly guessing the person's sex would be very high, and as we all know, the male and female sexes are clearly distinct from one another, despite what some may claim, but that's a topic for a different video. Anyway, by the same principle, a single gene might not be a very good predictor of someone's race, but that doesn't mean that the combined data on many genes won't be. This is the counter-argument that population geneticist A.W.F. Edwards called Lewontin's fallacy. Modern classifications of race aren't strictly based in science, and are somewhat based on social constructs that differ in various places in the world, such as the UK considering Asians as referring to people like Indians and Pakistanis, while the US, for example, would consider Asian to refer only to East Asians like the Chinese, Japanese and Koreans. However, in spite of these non-scientific race classifications used today, the fact is that genetic variation between human populations still correlate to a heavy degree with our understanding of race. Don't just take my word for it, here's what one of the world's leading authorities on population genetics at Harvard, David Reich, has to say. Differences in genetic ancestry that happen to correlate with many of today's racial constructs are real. As a matter of fact, a very recent study which analysed the genomes of 250,000 people of various races across the United States proved exactly that. This is a principal component analysis chart, very much like the cluster analysis chart I showed previously, which algorithmically maps points of data, in this case genomes, in a 2D space where each axis represents linear combinations of the original genetic data which captures the most variation in the dataset. Because natural groupings of genetically distinct human populations do exist, this results in clear and separated clusters forming on the PCA chart. The colours represent the self-reported race of the individuals, and as you can see, self-reported race correlates extremely closely with which cluster on the PCA chart their genome is grouped with. Race deniers that say that race is just a social construct are entirely misrepresenting things to imply that there is no significant genetic difference between human populations. It's simply semantics with the way we use language. While many modern classifications of race by both people and governments are in part influenced by things like ideology or culture and not genetics, all that means is that those specific classifications of race, used by the US Census and the like, are partially socially constructed, not that the concept of race itself is a social construct. Because at the end of the day, these three groups of people are all biologically distinct, enough so to where you can classify them as belonging to separate subspecies. First of all, I shouldn't have to argue against this, because even if all scientists across the world conclusively decided that biologically distinct populations of humans, i.e. races, didn't exist, it would be irrelevant in the face of the evidence I have presented. But anyway, let's look at the facts. It's true that if you look at surveys on anthropologists, which almost all surveys on this topic seem to focus on, then in Western Europe and North America, there is typically a consensus on race being a social construct. For example, a widely cited survey of American Anthropological Association members, conducted in 2013, found that only 14% agreed that the human population may be subdivided into biological races, and only 12% agreed that racial categories are determined by biology. 35% agreed that there was at least some genetic basis to race, while 65% said that there was zero genetic basis for race. These numbers are quite low, but this is entirely to be expected. The survey did nothing to ensure anonymity of members, so I would imagine that many feared that they may lose their job or have certain titles revoked for having non-politically correct opinions. Anthropologists also typically aren't at the forefront of human population genetics, at least when it comes to those who aren't physical or biological anthropologists. Many of the anthropologists surveyed were cultural anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, and so on. In 2004, a review of several surveys on anthropologists in North America and Europe was conducted, and it found that 31% of anthropologists in North America recognized race, while 43% in Europe recognized race. Let's look at some of the figures for Europe a little closer. From 2002 to 2003, surveys on biological anthropologists in Europe found that while only 31% of Western European anthropologists believed in biological races within humans, a whopping 68% of Eastern European anthropologists believed in biological races within humans. I personally think that this split is due to ideological reasons based around guilt of racism and colonialism, which is much less prevalent in Eastern Europe, resulting in Western European scientists being more likely to deny race than Eastern European scientists. A 2002 study looked at 779 articles in Acta Anthropologica Sinica, which is China's only biological anthropological journal, between 1982 to 2001. Of the 324 articles that directly dealt with human variation, every single one relied on the concept of race and not a single one questioned its value. The researchers concluded that the concept of race is deeply rooted in Chinese biological anthropology and fully accepted amongst scientists working in the discipline, and that this view was likely to be passed down to the next generation. Now, I understand that I am relying on data, some of which is over 20 years old, but that's because I unfortunately couldn't find newer studies that reflect more recent views, especially when it comes to biological anthropologists and geneticists. I assume that the data for Western countries has most likely seen an increase in the number of people that reject the concept of race for the reasons I described earlier. Perhaps an increase in countries like Poland too, due to Western countries having more of an impact on their culture and attitude towards race over the years. However, I don't see any reasons why countries like China would have had any substantial changes in their views on race, since they have not had any sort of cultural shift towards Western ideals. While I am on the subject of the science, I will quickly clarify one of the arguments I foresee some people using against my conclusions. That being that it is likely that some of the studies I have cited are written by people who disagree with the concept of race, perhaps even stating as such in the paper, and therefore the studies I have cited are somehow invalid because of that. But just because a scientist doesn't support something doesn't mean their findings can't be used to support that thing. Much like how Charles Darwin tried to interpret evolution as not being against biblical doctrine, or how Galileo tried to rationalize his scientific discoveries as not contradicting the Catholic Church. Atheists on Reddit will still cite them as being reasons why Christianity and other religions are wrong regardless. And you know what, it's totally within their right to do so. This has nothing to do with the existence of race. This is a form of guilt by association rather than a scientific argument regarding the existence of races. Just because something was used to do bad things in the past does not mean we should now deny the reality of modern scientific findings on that subject, no matter how righteous you may feel your cause to be. If you have any additional arguments, or if you wish to disprove something I have said, I strongly urge you to leave a comment, and if I get enough responses, I promise to make a second video addressing your points. Now that I have shown that human populations are genetically distinct, enough so that we can be categorized as separate subspecies otherwise known as human races, we are now all on the same page and can progress to the next section of this video. What does all this genetic diversity actually mean in practice? It's all well and good knowing the science behind it, but what does this mean in the real world? There are visual differences which everyone is already aware of in terms of bone structure, skin, hair and eye colour, height and so on. But everyone with a pair of eyeballs already knows this, so let's look at things that you can't see. And I know what you're all thinking, this video is about race, but so far I haven't discussed racing at all. I hear you, so let's fix that. Running, a technique that most land-based animals, including humans, developed as a way to get quickly to places such as far away from a predator or towards a prey. It has been a core component to the success of humans, and our body is extremely efficient at this task. Humans have always had an interest in competitive running, dating back to the Teotihuacan games between 632 BC and 1171 BC in Ireland, to see which humans can use this technique to travel faster than anyone else. Today, one of the most popular categories of this is the 100-meter sprint category, and one of the most coveted barriers of this category is to complete it in under 10 seconds. This is the history of the 10-second barrier. Before 1968, it was thought to be impossible, until one day, Jim Hines became the first person ever to officially run 100 meters in under 10 seconds. His time came to 9.95 seconds. He was from the United States and was of African descent. Jim Hines remained the only person to have ever accomplished this feat for about 9 years until 1977, when Silvio Leonard became the second person to officially beat the 10-second barrier in about 9.98 seconds. He was from Cuba and also of African descent. Fast forward 26 years, the year is now 2003. There has now been 38 people who have broken the 10-second barrier, all of them being of sub-Saharan African descent. Patrick Johnson then changed history by becoming the first person who isn't of sub-Saharan African descent to break the 10-second barrier. He had a time of 9.93 seconds and came from Australia and was half Aboriginal and half Irish. 7 years later in 2010, Christophe Lemaitre, a Frenchman, became the second non-African person to break the 10-second barrier, but only the 72nd person overall. 5 years later, Su Bingtian would become the first East Asian to break the 10-second barrier. Before the 2004 Athens Games, 494 of the top 500 times for the 100-meter sprint were held by sprinters who are of sub-Saharan African descent. This should give you an idea of just how significant genetic variation in humans is. Some people try to say that this is something unique to African Americans, that there is a culture which encourages sprinting or some other excuse, but this still wouldn't explain how there are 35 sub-Saharan Africans from the continent of Africa to have beaten the 10-second barrier, not to mention 3 of the 10 from the continent of Asia that beat the 10-second barrier being of sub-Saharan African descent, or 18 out of the 22 in Europe being of sub-Saharan African descent. There is no shared culture between these Africans and African Americans. The real reason North America has the most 10-second barrier breakers is because they have such a significant population of African descent, and it's also a first world country. They are more likely to have the proper nutrition and opportunities to compete in high-level sporting events and receive proper training, allowing them to reach their genetic potential in sprinting more so compared to an African living in Africa. There really isn't any good social or cultural explanations that race deniers can give for why sub-Saharan Africans seem to completely dominate sprinting. The only reasonable explanation is that it's all down to genetics, so let's take a look at specifically what is happening. The reason why sub-Saharan Africans are better at sprinting compared to any other race is because they have a higher density of fast-twitch muscle fibers as opposed to slow-twitch muscle fibers. Fast-twitch muscles are muscles that contract very quickly and forcefully, but also become fatigued more quickly, whereas slow-twitch muscles contract more slowly and with less force, but they can keep expanding and contracting for a long time without tiring. On average, studies have shown sub-Saharan Africans to have a higher density of fast-twitch muscle fibers compared to, say, those of European descent, which is great for short bursts of speed and quick movement like in sprinting. However, conversely, this also means that anything involving endurance, having more slow-twitch muscles will be better, like in swimming for example. Different races also have different centres of gravity. Sub-Saharan Africans, for example, have a centre of gravity that is 3% higher above the ground than for Europeans. This again gives Sub-Saharan Africans an advantage in running and Europeans an advantage in swimming. Just as a quick side note, I wanted to mention that all of the Sub-Saharan Africans in sprinting are pretty much entirely West African. As established earlier in the video, East and West Africans, although similar, are not exactly the same. Ethnic groups within Sub-Saharan Africa are some of the most genetically diverse within their race compared to any other race. In fact, the FST between East and West Africans is about 2.7%. For comparison, the FST between Greeks and Swedes is 0.84%, and Chinese and Japanese is about 0.7%. This is due to factors like having a significant amount of Eurasian admixture, as I discussed earlier. East Africans are actually quite good at long distance running, like marathons for example, of which almost all the top runners are of East African descent. East Africans generally have longer legs, shorter torsos, thinner ankles, thinner calves, and a lower body weight, which would all help with long distance running. There are also a lot of differences in health between racial groups. Sickle cell anemia, which I mentioned earlier in the video, is most prevalent in populations of sub-Saharan African ancestry, but it also exists in other populations afflicted by malaria, like in the Middle East and India. Looking at the data, sickle cell anemia occurs in about 73 cases per 1,000 black newborns and 3 cases per 1,000 white newborns in the US. The reason why sickle cell disease is prevalent in different ethnic groups is because the sickle cell gene variant defends against malaria, and these groups evolved in regions with a higher prevalence of malaria. Many other genetic diseases are also more prevalent in these areas, such as thalassaemias. A lot of these single gene disorders arise within certain populations, typically because they help fight against infectious diseases. Cystic fibrosis is another example, occurring at rates of 1 in 2,500 for whites, 1 in 17,000 for blacks, and 1 in 31,000 for Asians in the US. Another example of differences between races pertaining to health is stem cells and bone marrow. Bone marrow has to be transferred between members of the same ethnic background because there needs to be a high level of genetic similarity between the donor and the patient. It's why you have recruitment targeted at specific races where more donors are needed. Mixed race individuals also find it very difficult to find a suitable donor for this reason. There are significant differences in different types of cancer as well. Prostate cancer, for instance, is far more prevalent in sub-Saharan Africans compared to Europeans. This could be due to hormonal differences, such as with sub-Saharan Africans having high levels of estrogen compared to Europeans. Race is also important to consider for pharmaceutical corporations when creating new medicine. A 2014 review stated that race and ethnicity can contribute to inter-individual differences in drug exposure and/or response, which may alter risk-benefit in certain populations. Approximately 1/5 of new drugs approved in the past 6 years demonstrated differences in exposure and/or response across racial/ethnic groups, translating to population-specific prescribing recommendations in a few cases. When data from diverse populations were lacking, additional post-marketing studies were recommended. I could go on, but you get the idea. Differences in health between races is a really good example of why denying genetic differences in race is dangerous, because race is useful when it comes to understanding and aiding in adverse effects on people's health. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my look into various differences that occur between human races. Make sure to like and subscribe, and hold on, I think I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah. Differences in things like athletic ability and health are all well and good, but high intelligence and our big brains is what defines us as a species. Many of your life outcomes are very heavily influenced by intelligence, such as your job, education, and the lifestyle you live. Despite what some may have you believe,
Your brain's in your skull, man. It's not being affected by the sun or the wind or the rain. It's not being affected by the difference in climate between the equatorial belt in Africa and like the cold fjords of Finland. Your brain's up here in your skull. It is insulated from the main environmental factors that would cause a genetic change to begin with.
there is a difference between our brains. Like shown earlier, many gene groups associated with the brain differ substantially between races, and why shouldn't it? There are so many physiological differences between us, there's no good reason to assume that psychological differences wouldn't also manifest between races. What is intelligence? Psychologist Linda Gottfredson described it as a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. But how do we actually measure intelligence? For that, we have to look at IQ. IQ is a number used to show the general intelligence of a person in comparison to the general population, obtained via a set of psychometric tests. Multiple different aspects of intelligence are tested, such as reasoning, spatial ability, memory, processing speed, and so on. The results of the tests are averaged into one number to give a general level of one's intelligence. All of these aspects of intelligence are very highly correlated, so if you perform well in one aspect, you are also very likely to perform well in all of the others. Your IQ is standardized amongst a representative sample of the population in such a way that the average will always be 100. A standard deviation represents 15 IQ points, and 95% of the population have scores within 2 standard deviations of the average result of 100, or between 70 to 130. 2/3 of the population have IQ scores within 1 standard deviation of the mean, or in other words, within the range 85 to 115. Studies have shown IQ to be a very strong predictor in many different life outcomes, such as performance in school, job performance and the kind of job you end up getting, how much money you make, your chance of being a criminal and committing acts of violence, even how smart your peers view you as, and so much more. I don't think IQ is the end-all be-all to the value of a person or their success in life. Personality traits like conscientiousness and agreeableness, for example, are also important, and these don't have any clear correlation with IQ. But even so, and even if IQ didn't measure intelligence per se, IQ still certainly measures something real that can significantly alter your chances of success in life based on all the correlates I've shown. In an official capacity, IQ is used to diagnose disorders, primarily intellectual disability, where anyone with an IQ under 70 is classified as having the disorder. Some police departments in the United States won't let you be a police officer if your IQ is too high, with the justification that high IQ individuals would get bored and have high turnover rates. And the US military used to require an IQ of 85, although they have since switched to using their own tests of intelligence. IQ is also very highly reliable. This means that the IQ tests are highly consistent when taken multiple times at different occasions. For modern tests, the standard error of measurement is about 3 points, or in other words, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that a person's true IQ, so to speak, is in range from 3 points above to 3 points below the test IQ. You could also say that there's a 95% chance that the true IQ is in range from 4 to 5 points above to 4 to 5 points below the test IQ, depending on the test in question. Now that we have established what IQ is and why it's important and reliable, we can now look at the cause of IQ and why it's mostly based on genetics. Now, IQ is highly heritable. What is heritability, you may ask? Heritability is a statistic used to measure the degree of variation in a trait in a population that is due to genetic variation between individuals in that population. The concept can be better understood by asking the question, what is the proportion of the variation in a given trait within a population that is not explained by the environment or random chance? You can work out the heritability of a trait based on twin studies, which I also mentioned in my previous video, but essentially it's done by comparing the similarity of a trait of identical twins who share 100% of their genes to fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. That being said, let's look at the facts on IQ and heritability. The heritability of IQ increases with age, meaning environmental factors like the home you grew up in, how your parents raised you, the school you went to and so on, have a weaker impact on your intelligence as you grow into adulthood. If environment was the major factor in IQ, you would expect the opposite to occur, where environment becomes more important as you age, but this does not occur. By the time you are an adult, IQ is 80% heritable, meaning 80% of variance in IQ is attributable to genetic differences, while 20% is due to other factors like environment. Studies have shown time and time again that races do differ substantially by IQ. What I'm showing on screen now is the aggregate data of hundreds of different IQ studies on different races and their location. So, what is causing this gap between different races and their IQs? You might say it's because of socioeconomic factors. Certain races are poorer than others, and this leads to those races being deprived in some way and thus having a lower IQ. This is demonstrably false. If you look at the average household income of African Americans, for example, who have an average IQ of 85 and a per capita income of $29,300. Compare this to, say, Hungary with an average IQ of 99.24 and a per capita income of $19,800, or Estonia with an average IQ of 100.72 and a per capita income of $27,200, Belarus with an IQ of 101.6 and a per capita income of $7,700, or China with an average IQ of 104.1 and a per capita income of $13,400. These groups of people are all poorer than African Americans, yet have substantially higher IQs. If you look at SAT scores in the US, which correlate closely with IQ and can be viewed as a proxy for conventional IQ tests, the gap in performance between races still persists. Even African Americans with parents making $160,000 to $200,000 a year still perform worse than the poorest whites and Asians whose parents make less than $20,000 a year. Okay, so what about cultural bias? I see this one a lot, the idea that IQ tests are created and biased in favour of white people, but this doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Obviously there is the fact that Northeast Asians consistently have higher IQs compared to those of European descent, both in their own native homeland and abroad. Considering again the black-white IQ gap in the United States, cultural bias also doesn't make a lot of sense since both groups speak the same language and both grew up in American culture. In general, when administering IQ tests, researchers will use IQ tests that are culturally adapted to that population, translating it into their language and so on. There are also tests which can be used that don't contain any use of language, such as Raven's progressive matrices. A 2008 survey on experts on the subject of intelligence also found that 73.3% agreed that IQ tests were not racially biased, while only 13.3% thought they were. Let's look now at some of the evidence supporting race differences in IQ being genetic. If you look at mixed race people, you will find time and time again that the IQ of mixed race people on average tends to fall within that of the parents. An interesting example of this is when it comes to the Americas, where significant amounts of race mixing has occurred between Europeans and the natives. European admixture is positively correlated with IQ. Adoption studies also help to support the idea of IQ being genetic, and that an equal environment would not close the IQ gap between races. The Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, one of the most famous adoption studies out there, looked at black, white and mixed race children who were adopted by white middle upper class parents with an average IQ of 120. At age 17, whites had an average IQ of 106, mixed race 99 and blacks 89. What's interesting to note as well is that the same difference between mixed race and black children occurred also in cases where the adopting parents wrongly thought that the mixed race child had two black parents. Certain gene variants have also been found to be associated with IQ. One such study looked at 9 gene variants associated with IQ and found that the ones positively associated with intelligence were more likely to be found amongst Europeans and East Asians compared to the Sub-Saharan Africans, and vice versa, the ones negatively associated with intelligence were more likely to be found in Sub-Saharan Africans and less likely to be found in Europeans and East Asians. The predicted IQ of various different nations based on the prevalence of these gene variants had an enormous 93% correlation with the actual IQ of those nations. Other studies have also shown that the more genetically distant any two populations are, the larger the IQ difference between those two nations will be. Brain size is very highly heritable and determined by your genetics, and brain size also has a small positive correlation with IQ. Brain size also differs by race. Numerous studies that compare the size of brains by race, whether by autopsy or MRI scans, consistently show Sub-Saharan Africans to have a smaller brain than Europeans, who have a smaller brain than East Asians. It correlates exactly with what you would expect based on how IQ differs between races. All of these factors together make for a compelling case for IQ differences in race being at least partially genetic. Of course, environmental factors like nutrition, childhood abuse, breastfeeding, among others, do contribute to IQ, and do contribute to some extent to race differences in IQ. The IQ of Sub-Saharan Africans in Africa being 71, for example, I don't think reflects the genetic potential of Sub-Saharan Africans, since when you compare to First World nations, this increases to about 85. The same as well for South Asians, going from 84 in South Asia to 93 in Britain and Australia. This can be explained by the improvement in their environment, but also that immigrants tend to be more intelligent on average compared to where they came from. To some extent at least, immigrants to Western nations may be required to be highly skilled, such as being a doctor, to be allowed to migrate. Descendants of migrants to Western nations may also be intermixed with people within the host nation. A half Indian, half British person could end up counting as an Indian on an IQ test in Britain, for example, and this could also skew the results, especially in the case of African Americans who have on average a quarter European ancestry. Still, all of this combined is nowhere near enough to close the large gap between IQ, which still persists for other races living in Western nations. A genetic basis for differences in IQ between races has some important implications. It means that race differences in life outcomes that are strongly associated with IQ, crime, income, educational achievement, your job, and so on, are at least in part fixed. Different races will always be ahead or behind others, even if everyone had an equal environment. Many of the policies of governments, universities, corporations, and other institutions are made with the assumption that all races are innately equal, so low representation of certain races in high positions of power or income, for example, must therefore be a result of racial discrimination or minorities not being given enough opportunities. This is how we end up with DEI initiatives and affirmative action, which discriminate against high IQ and high performing races like Europeans and East Asians in order to help low IQ and low performing races. It also has implications for immigration policy. IQs in Western nations like the United States and in Europe have been declining substantially since the 1990s. These are also nations which have seen a massive rise in the number of migrants from low IQ nations. It stands to reason then that mass immigration is at least in part responsible for the lowering of IQ in Western nations. If these issues aren't addressed soon, then Europe and North America will continue to decline in intelligence and East Asians will probably reign supreme. On a final note, these group differences in IQ and every other characteristic discussed in this video is just that, group differences, averages. The average of a race on any given characteristic does not define what an individual within that race is capable of. There are outliers for all characteristics for all races, great sprinters of European descent, scientists of sub-Saharan African descent, and East Asians with dry earwax, probably. Individuals should be treated as that, individuals. If someone is smart and of a lower IQ race, then of course you wouldn't treat that person as if they weren't just because of what the average IQ of their race is. At the same time, however, just because outliers exist does not mean that group averages don't exist or that it's not useful to know. Men are taller than women on average, but pointing out that you know a woman that is 6'4" does not disprove that. Group average differences will still lead to group average outcomes, like with high positions of power in a business being occupied by more high IQ people, for example. There you have it. Race is real. The human species can be considered as having multiple genetically distinct races or rather subspecies, and this genetic variation between races leads to significant physiological and psychological differences emerging. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something from it, please spread the video out as much as you can so as many people as possible can learn the truth about race and the differences that lie between us. If you have any questions or thoughts on anything I've said in the video or any suggestions for future videos, please let me know down in the comments below. All the sources for everything in the video can be found in the description below, and you can also follow me on my X at Commander_Waldo, and make sure you like and subscribe the video as well. Thanks for watching.